They drove off with the car full of luggage and the radio playing, leaving the taillights to shrink into the mist. I remember the sound of gravel under tires, the sudden scandal of the engine, and then silence. My suitcase sat by my feet, the handle damp with Scottish rain, and the lane ahead was nothing but wet grass and a sky that looked like a promise it had already broken. I stood there, 67 years old, in a coat that had been my mother's, with a pocket full of receipts and a phone that had 40% battery and nowhere useful to charge. My daughter had said, with that practiced politeness she saved for strangers, "Margaret, you can catch the next bus into town." And then she shut the door. Her husband waved. The boot of the car slammed. They were gone. If you want to know the shape of abandonment, it doesn't come in one tidy piece. It comes in a collection, little slights, a few evasions, and a final action that pulls the rug out from under your feet and watches you go. That was the beginning, and because the beginning is where everyone asks the same question, how did you not call someone? I will tell you plainly. I called, I tried, I walked, I bargained, and I learned something I should have known all along. You can be brilliant at putting other people's histories in glass and labels, and still, in your own life, be surprised by how fast things can unravel. If this is speaking to you, stay with me, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. I want to know I'm not the only one who has felt the wind take everything. The invitation read like a small holiday in a book. Come to Scotland. We'll show you the family farm. Bring your stories. Bring that scrapbook you keep. Jessica signed it off with love heart emojis, and Brian sent a photo of a stone cottage at dusk. They'd both been living there for a year, trying something new, is how Jessica put it, and they'd been insistent that I visit. She stroked my ego in practical ways. "Mother, the children would love you. You can tell them about the museum pieces." And foolishly, I let her stroke. Decisions are never made in one moment. They are a series of small permissions. A bookkeeper lends a pen at the wrong time, and later the signature is wrong by inches. We flew over the Atlantic. I rode with a folded map and a bag of mints, and a head full of polite, well-practiced stories about provenance and conservation. People who know me from my old museum life will say I am careful. I am. But there is a difference between being careful with artifacts and with the people who hold your life. Objects are honest in their injuries. People are not. The first week was ordinary enough. There were foggy mornings where the sunlight fell like coin on the peat. The children, 8 and 12, took to me with the ferocious hunger of small people who know how to get what they want. Jessica was attentive in the way of someone who needs witnesses.
She would ask questions about a brooch here, a photograph there. "Where did you get this?" she'd say, flipping through a notebook where I had copy-pasted little notes from my museum days. I told her. She listened, sometimes, with the bored intensity of someone cataloguing the facts for later use. The subtle things began like dust between pages. She began to call late at night, asking for small amounts of money until payday, and I obliged because why would my daughter not be trustworthy? She borrowed my card just to reserve a train ticket and returned it a day later with a shrug. Her voice shifted sometimes in ways I didn't like, clipped, efficient, a little too practiced at apologies. Brian, on the other hand, was all smiles and practicality, a man who found comfort in spreadsheets and an answer to every problem. He built affection the way carpenters build fences, measure, cut, fit. They were a tidy pair. It made the betrayal feel all the more constructed. The night they left me on the lane, I had been slow to pack. I had a cold, and my bones complained now more than they used to. Jessica told me to hurry up, as if my deliberate hands were a menace to their schedule. There was an argument, a snapped phrase, and then the practical cruelty of instructions. "Get out. There's a bus at 9. We'll see you in town." It had the air of finality because they wanted it to. I walked until the lane met a main road and then found a telephone box, which felt old-fashioned and merciful. The driver at the bus station said there were no buses due for an hour. The roof of the shelter dripped in sympathetic taps, and by the time I made it to the nearest village, I was soaked and hollowed out the way a shell is emptied by the sea. That's where I met Moira. She ran the inn on the corner like it was a lighthouse. If you have been to the Highlands, you know how an inn can hold a small population of the world under its beams, locals with their weather-hardened faces, travellers with their unsettled eyes, and a landlady who was equal parts iron and warmth. Moira took one look at me, at the suitcase and the coat, and ordered a pot of tea as if she had known me all her life. She gave me a bed for £20 and a meal that had more butter in it than I should have eaten, and while she stirred the broth, she asked me one practical question. Did they mean to leave you? They said the next bus, I told her, because it was the truth, and truth felt easier to spill to strangers who would not carry it away. Sometimes the next bus doesn't come, she said, with that dry Scottish melody. Sometimes you have to make yourself stay. People become our chosen family when blood fails. Moira was the first person in that week who treated the situation like the most natural thing in the world.
She put my suitcase in a dry corner. She patched my socks with a little thread and a kind of economy that felt like compassion. And she did something else. She asked a question that would become the perimeter of the entire story. Do you have everything you should have? I thought I had. I had my passport, a small sum in cash, and the contents of my handbag. But when I turned on my phone that evening and noticed a notification from my banking app, 3 messages unread, a blinking little thing like a bad omen, I felt that small cold that sits on your neck when something is wrong. I pulled the messages up. There were 2 pending authorizations I didn't recognize, and a withdrawal flagged as authorized in my name. I called the number on the back of my card. The voice at the bank was slow, institutional, and practiced at the choreography of people's discomfort. Yes, Miss Caldwell. We have a recent authorization dated the 21st of May for a transfer to an account registered under Jessica Turner, the voice said. Do you recognize that? No, I said. Are you with access to your online accounts right now? My hands were still damp from the rain. The phone was of no help in the middle of the inn. I gave them what information I could. The customer service rep said they would flag the account. They would freeze transfers pending further verification. They asked me a question I had not expected. Do you give anyone power of attorney over your accounts? The word was a break. I had never given Jessica power of attorney. In my careful life, I had always kept my name on the documents myself. A signature matters. It is an anchor. But then signatures can be copied in little clean ways, and papers can be signed when eyes are closed. I went to bed with the telephone line to the bank saved in my head and a new, unpleasant understanding. The abandonment had likely been part of a larger plan. It was not just impatience or cruelty. It was, I realized in the dark, a pattern. Morning in the village was bright in a way I did not expect. The sky peeled back. The rain became a promise again. I slept like a person who had been allowed a small mercy. Moira breakfasted with me and asked me where my head was. It's not just the money, I said. It's the feeling. The way they left. It was so deliberate. She nodded as if she had seen that kind of thing before. People think family is a shield, she said. Sometimes it's a spear. We started the practical work. Moira sat at my table with a pen and a ledger. She had that blunt knack for cataloging. Perhaps we'd both been born under the sign of the detail-oriented. I pulled out a small leather folio I'd brought, full of scribbled entries about items I'd cataloged for the museum years ago, receipts from auctions, notes about Providence. It felt like a ridiculous thing to clutch in this moment, but it also felt like holding a life support system. Do you have any documents that say these things belong to you? She asked. I have letters, I have notes, my grandmother's name on some tags, but nothing that would stop a determined person from taking them if they wanted. Then we'll make some noise, she said. We don't let people walk off with other people's histories. It sounds dramatic when I tell it that way now, and parts of me bristled at sounding like a person in an old-fashioned novel, but there is a truth in the way a library smells when you open it. Authority, knowledge, safeguard. I had the habit of cataloging things for a living. The training comes back to you like a reflex. Items must be listed, photographed, described in detail. Provenance must be traced. Every object needs a story that shows where it has been. If you can show that, you can show ownership. Moira and I set to work. We photographed the few pieces I had with me, an old silver brooch with a torn pin, a faded oil portrait of a woman who looked like my aunt, a bundle of lace wrapped in tissue. We used a retired camera Moira kept for postcards, the kind that takes pictures with the quiet patience of witnesses. The post office delivered extra batteries and a roll of bubble wrap because Moira insisted on being precise. That afternoon, while I sat with my knees under the table and Moira busied herself behind the bar, my phone buzzed again, another bank notification. This time, it told me there had been an access attempt from an IP address that traced to an internet cafe in town and a signature verification request for a legal document transferring assets. I stared at the phone until my eyes hurt. I called back the bank and asked for a copy of the documents they were referring to. They emailed them to me in a way that felt both mundane and monstrous. Attached scans, a clean header, an authorized signature. The signature looked, on the surface, like mine. It had similar loops, the same slant toward the right. But signatures carry small idiosyncrasies, the way people swallow certain syllables. I knew the curve of my capital M. Something was wrong with the flow of the ink. It was too tidy. I took the scanned document to a friend, someone I knew from my museum days who did conservation and had friends who were signatory experts. They told me, carefully, that handwriting analysis is a field and that some so-called experts make claims with theatrical certainty. But they also told me something I needed to hear. There are ways to check. Your bank will assist, but you should get an independent look. That independent look would come later, with a solicitor and a formal expert. But even then, the bank's document had already shifted the axis of my life. It wasn't only that something had been taken. It was that people who should have protected me, my daughter, her husband, had crossed a line into falsifying legal instruments. Moira listened without dramatics. She poured my tea and said, "We should find where they've hidden what they can."
If they were clever enough to forge things, they were clever where it matters, behind doors where no one looks. There was an old warehouse, she told me, that had been used by various people in the town. Farmers stored hay crosswise in the autumn. In the summer, the space smelled of dust and sunlight. A man named Duncan, a distant relative of Moira's, kept family records in his house and had once mentioned a storage space. If my family had things moved, chances were good they'd end up somewhere like that, out of sight, then out of mind. The idea seemed absurd, but absurdity and hope sometimes travel in the same boat. We found the warehouse by walking down a lane where nettles grew against the stone. The door was rusted and heavy, but Duncan had a key. He unlocked it with the air of someone opening a chest that had been unopened for decades. Inside, the dust remembered the footsteps of people who had not visited in years. The light fell in narrow streams through a high window. There were crates and trunks and moth-eaten cloths. When he lifted the first lid, the smell of old wood and varnish rose. There were framed paintings stacked like sleeping things, a trunk of textiles, a pair of brass candlesticks that were the sort of thing you pass in an auction catalog and you think, "I'll never need one of those," until suddenly you do. Everything was wrapped in tissue brown with age. It was a house of objects that had been kept from the light. We started to unwrap things like we were archaeologists, with gloves, with cameras, with the care of people handling someone else's memory. I traced the backs of frames where old labels bore the museum accession numbers my grandmother had used. In the pocket of a trunk, I found a letter folded like a secret. The handwriting was my great-grandmother's. The address was a small village in Yorkshire I had never visited. And there, sewn into the hem of a dress, was a tiny label with my grandmother's maiden name stitched in faded thread. Duncan looked at me with a softness that felt like permission. "These were here a long time," he said, "passed on when the family thought it best to keep them safe." Safe. The word felt slippery. For them, safety had been about hiding. For Jessica, safety seemed to be about owning what she wanted without asking. There is a difference between stewardship and seizure. Knowing that things were here, knowing where the chain of custody could be traced, was the first tangible anchor I had in weeks. When Moira and I photographed and cataloged and began the slow work of provenance, something in me that had been asleep woke up. I had spent decades making labels for other people's treasures, writing down who had owned this, who had donated that, tracing the tiny stitches of history that make ownership legible. The work is, in its essence, about telling the truth of where things have been. Suddenly, the skills that had been part of my profession were not just comfortable rituals, they were tools for reclaiming my life. We called an expert, Dr. Catherine Murray, on the recommendation of someone at the small local museum. She had the calm of someone whose profession is to disarm surprises. When she arrived, she smelled of the city and coffee and the kind of certainty that comes with reading 100 provenance reports. She looked at the lace, tapped the frame glass, and nodded in ways that made me feel as if the objects themselves were beginning to speak. "These could be worth a modest sum if authenticated," she said quietly. "But it's the paper trail that matters. If your grandmother's name is on the labels, and if we can corroborate that with estate records, then these are part of your family estate." "Part of my family estate is currently absent," I said, and the sentence felt small and inadequate. She took notes. She explained lightly what provenance means in plain language, a history of ownership, like a ledger, that helps people understand where an item came from and whether it's legal to sell. "If there's a clear chain, you have a claim," she said. "If not, it becomes complicated. But we can start with the letters and the labels and the ledger entries you have." We began the paperwork properly then.
not as a dramatized gesture of revenge, though if there was any taste of that, it was understandable, but as a formal reestablishment of rights. I bought a ring binder and a folder labeled Caldwell Provenance. I made copies. I went to the local registrar where Duncan coaxed old entries from dusty ledgers. Each small document felt like a nail in a house I was building for myself. But the story does not progress in straight lines. While we were cataloging and photographing, another thread pulled taut. Jessica texted. It was the sort of message that oscillated between warmth and calculation. I'm sorry about earlier. We all get stressed. The kids miss you. Can we meet tomorrow? We'll bring the children. I want us to be a family. Her timing was artful. People who manipulate learn to use emotion as currency. She brought up the grandchildren like a velvet banner. The sight of them was enough to make my knees go weak. Children negotiate the world with honesty. They offer hugs that are like truth, uncalculated, urgent. When the little ones arrived the next day, they ran to me. They smelled like jelly and school and the simple calcium of children. They asked to hear about the brooch and about how oxygen makes brass green. They wanted to sit on my lap and be fed biscuits. Their faces were a claim on my heart. Jessica smiled with a practiced softness that made my throat close. Brian looked like a man who had decided how the world should be and could not see the harm in making it so. He had a grin that fit the angles of his jaw and the tidy way he thought of things as problems to be solved.
"We're trying to get things sorted," he said. "We thought some estate matters could be simplified if you let us handle a few things." Handle a few things is a phrase people use when they think power is a convenience. I wanted at that moment to believe her. I wanted to take the children to the park and have a day where the problem was nothing more than whether to stop for ice cream. I put aside my files and told stories about an old curator who once fell asleep among the stacks. Later that night, when the house had settled and the grandchildren slept in a room that smelled of peppermint and bedtime, I overheard something that I was not meant to. I had gone to fetch a folder I'd mislaid and passed the open door of the sitting room. Jessica and Brian were speaking in low voices. I could hear the soft purr of the heater, Brian's calculator app tapping away, and Jessica's words, closing like a trapdoor. "We'll need the document signed, and then the transfers can be initiated," Brian said. "They'll think it's cleaners or just routine. We'll make a paper trail that looks legitimate." There are moments in life when a single sentence becomes a fulcrum. I stood like a listener frozen until the words made sense. They were not apologizing. They were planning. The grandchildren laughed in their sleep in the next room. The ordinary world, tepid tea, infant breaths, sat beside the planning of theft like the impossible adjacency of seasons. I didn't confront them that night. There are many reasons for that. I had children asleep under the same roof. I was in unknown territory. I did not have proof other than the words in my ears. But I tell you this, when you hear the plan, your mind becomes a machine for strategy. The humiliation becomes a fuel, and your old trades, the ones that made you skilled in one life, begin to feel less like a museum of memory and more like a set of tools. The next day, with a calm I had to catalyze with every small ritual, tea, a walk, a list, I went to the bank. I took the copies of the forged authorization with me and asked to speak to the manager. The conversations with banks are an odd form of intimacy. You are asking strangers to look at the fissures in your life and intervene. The bank took the documents and photographed them. They told me gently and with their institutional patience that these things take time. There was a formal process, an internal compliance team, and possibly law enforcement engagement. The word fraud hung there like a bad photograph. I also called a solicitor recommended by an old colleague. James had the kind of voice that suggests steadiness. He spoke with the slow cadence of someone practiced at walking through people's worst days. He listened to me without interruption and took notes in a neat hand. "We'll need the original documents," he said. "We can request an urgent hold on transfers and see about injunctions. But remember, Margaret, this is not about vengeance.
It's about preventing further loss and establishing a legal record. There is comfort in legality. It is not immediate comfort, and it is not cinematic. It is forms, signatures, and awkward visits to offices that smell of lemon disinfectant. But for an old museum woman, forms are familiar. Accession forms, donor agreements, labels. The law is another bureaucracy that likes order. I liked being in it. It suited me. Meanwhile, the crates we had opened produced bit by bit the kind of findings that make even the most hardened curator's heart thrum. A portrait, conservative in its brushwork, which Dr. Murray said could be contemporaneous with the 1880s. A silver goblet with an engraved crest that matched an estate note in my grandmother's letters. Each item was small, and yet each added up to a ledger. We began to put the business of our lives into an economic frame, which felt strange and yet necessary. If these things had value, then they were not merely sentimental. They were claims. We drew up an agreement, Moira and I, with Duncan as a witness, that the objects found in the warehouse would be temporarily held under joint custody while we investigated. We signed a simple memorandum. I provided proof of family connection, Duncan supplied records, and Moira offered the use of the inn's storeroom for cataloging. I remember feeling the paper under my thumb like a plinth, systematized, formal, necessary. We were not trying to hide anything. We were trying to make the world legible. Jessica noticed the change. She had arrived for a meal and found me at the bar with a stack of photographs. "What are you doing with those?" she asked, with the little impatience of someone who prefers swift solutions. "Making a record," I said. "Can't we just sort this privately?" she asked. There was a pleading edge to it now, as if the easy plan had been disturbed. "I would rather do things properly," I said. "If they belong to the family, we should know. There are legal steps we must take." Her eyes narrowed like the slit of a shutter. "You're making this into a big thing," she said. "We can come to an agreement." "An agreement that involves you taking control of assets and me signing papers after the fact is not an agreement I find comfortable," I answered. I said it with a firmness I barely felt. That night, after she tucked the children in and Brian was discussing, loudly and perhaps too comfortably, the practicalities of simplifying the estate, I went back to my room. I lay awake and thought about the arc of my life. For 30 years, I had cataloged what people entrusted to museums, taken down their names, traced their histories. Now I was in the odd position of trying to prove that my history belonged to me. I thought about the small humiliations that had accumulated over months and years. I thought about the time Jessica used my card without asking for concert tickets and returned it as if she had done me a favor. About the little lies that had once seemed necessary to smooth family friction. About the time a painting I had thought was sold for a pittance turned up in a private collection. Sometimes we let people take pieces from us because we think they'll return them with explanations. Sometimes they don't. The next morning, the bank called. Their voice was still that of the institutional world, slow and measured. They said they had put an initial flag on my account. They asked for more details and suggested that I get sworn statements from witnesses who could corroborate the authenticity of my grandmother's labels and the letters we'd found. They also indicated they might share their findings with a financial investigations unit if there were sufficient evidence. I told them everything I knew. I told them about the signature that did not glide like mine, about the IP address traced to a local internet cafe, about the legal document they had flagged. I did not tell them what I had overheard, too specific, yet not yet evidenced, but I told them enough to set in motion a proper response. And then Jessica came for dinner, with 2 children in tow, and a smile that tried to combine apology with expectation. She put on the kind of bright patience mothers put on in front of small people. "I want us to be family again," she said, in a tone that could have been sincere or a mask. She watched me closely when I did not immediately answer. "We can make things right," she added, almost pleading. Making things right is a different thing from paying back what was taken. Making things right implies erasing the wrong without consequence. It is a tempting phrase. It is also sometimes a trap. That evening I told Jessica I was consulting a solicitor. She attempted to laugh it off, as if the law were a parlor game. And then, when that failed, she softened into the role she thought would work. Apologetic, maternal. The grandchildren wanted a bedtime story. I told them one about a woman who kept treasures safe, and how the treasures sometimes had to wait to be claimed. The story was not for them. It was for me. You will understand perhaps why I delayed confrontation. I had children under the same roof. I had a legal process just starting. I had allies who insisted on doing things properly. There is an ethical architecture to righting wrongs, and I wanted to walk through it. I also wanted to gather enough evidence so that when action came, it would be factual and not merely emotional. The plan was forming in the small, meticulous way I have always preferred. Document, corroborate, present. We began to make a list of witnesses, to assemble the letters, to photograph every seam. Every small piece of physical proof was an argument. I became, in a way I had not expected to, an investigator of my own life. It was tiring work, and it was steadying work. It took me out of the rawness of feeling and into the plains of procedure. Towards the end of the week, something happened that would unsettle everything in ways I could not have anticipated. I had been at the inn arranging boxes when a delivery arrived, a man with a clipboard and a polite, professional manner. He asked for Jessica Turner. I watched Jessica open the door and take the delivery with an ease I recognized immediately as the handling of someone used to things arriving in their favor. The man noted a package address, there was a little exchange about signatures, and then he left. Later, in the kitchen, Brian laughed at something small, a joke about logistics, about moving items between warehouses. I tried to read the tone and missed some small inflection. Was this arch? Was this complacent? The children slept, and the adults spoke softly about the arrangements, while I catalogued the brooch that had been my grandmother's. The world seemed to be moving on parallel tracks. At midnight, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat at the table and wrote a list. It was the kind of list I had written innumerable times in my life. Objects and notations. Frame, portrait, 1880s. Silver goblet, engraved crest. Lace, stitched label. Letter, great-grandmother, Yorkshire. Beside each, I wrote the documentary evidence we had. Label, mention in ledger, letterhead, local registrar entry. Each ticked box felt like a pebble in a child's game, small and solid and important. The next morning, I made calls. Dr. Murray confirmed she could do in-depth authentication, but warned me there was no rush. Some items needed conservation before a definitive attribution could be made. James, the solicitor, asked for the originals. He promised to draft letters to the bank and prepare an application to freeze any accounts that might be shown to be connected to unauthorized transfers. He spoke in his measured timbre about processes, injunctions, and the need to avoid public drama until there was a clear legal path. I want to be clear, he said. We do this properly. We involve the authorities if there is evidence of fraud. We do not set traps outside the law. Of course, I said. I don't want anyone to be hurt. I want what is mine returned, and I want to protect the children. He reminded me gently that the presence of grandchildren complicates things emotionally, but not legally. He would, he said, need to show a chain of title. He would need the documents. He asked me to sign a form giving him permission to request records from the bank and to liaise with them on my behalf. I did. By then, the list of small indignities loomed heavy. A trip to the local post office had revealed that packages addressed in my name had been redirected. A neighbor's testimony helped confirm that crates had been moved in the dark of night. The fabric of events, pieced together, began to show a pattern I could not deny. That pattern is not a simple portrait of villainy.
People are rarely flat. They are complicated. They are at times loving. The grandchildren still ran to me for biscuits and stories. Jessica brought me tea in the morning and could be tender. But tenderness and theft are not mutually exclusive. Many betrayals are clothed in affection so that they can be executed without too much questioning. It was during one of those ordinary afternoons, as Moira and I were photographing another frame, that I had a thought that felt foolishly bright, to treat the situation like a museum case. We would make the evidence visible. We would show the chain of custody. We would make public, in calm protest, something that could not be denied, that these objects had belonged to the family and that they had been taken without proper authority. Make the world see what you see, Moira said, as if she had read my mind. People can't ignore a thing that's plainly documented. The concept lodged in me like a seed. If you make a thing visible, no one can easily erase it. Museums deal in visibility. Law, in a different register, does too. There would be a time for the legal machinery and a time for the public ledger. Right now, the ledger was my ring binder, my inventory list, my photographs, and my notes. It was small, but heavy. At dusk that evening, Jessica came into the kitchen with sun in her hair and a softness she reserved for the children. It had the practiced cadence of someone trying to demonstrate normalcy. She sat and said, "I know things have been difficult. Let's talk about how we move forward." "Do you mean talk or make decisions?" I asked. The question was precise. She blinked as if the distinction had not occurred to her. "Move forward," she said. "Take control so you don't have to worry. We can manage the estate.
"You shouldn't have to do all of this at your age." What she meant, in the language she used, was clear. Hand over the documents, sign on dotted lines, let us be the management. The offer was elegant in its brutality. I looked at the children, who were coloring quietly in the corner, and I saw in them the reason I needed to be cautious. There are lines, I thought, that once crossed change who you are to your grandchildren. I also thought about justice in a very practical sense. If there were evidence of fraud, if documents had been forged, if transfers had been made under false pretenses, then there were avenues of redress that did not require me to surrender my agency out of fear. At that moment, I understood with new clarity a shape of the future. I could either let things proceed and hope for the best, or I could make my actions deliberate and informed. I chose the latter. It felt like stepping back into the life I'd had in the museum. Catalog, document, corroborate, and when necessary, present with authority. But making that choice meant more work. It meant interviews with experts, affidavits, and the slow machinery of law. It also meant potentially breaking a family.
I told Jessica, gently but firmly, that I wanted the solicitor involved before any signatures were written. She smiled the thin smile of someone who thinks delay will be an annoyance she can muscle through. That night, after the children were finally asleep and the house held its breath, I sat at the small kitchen table and went over the list again. The ledger, the photographs, the letters, the signatures, each item was a small victory. And yet somewhere in the margin of my mind, a darker truth waited. If they were planning to act, as I suspected, they might try before the law could stop them. I felt the old familiar muscle of strategy awaken. It had been years since I orchestrated an exhibition opening where timing and precision mattered, but the skills were the same. Timing, verification, and control. I made a plan on paper. Gather originals, secure the warehouse items under documented custody, have the solicitor request immediate holds on suspicious transfers, and involve the bank's fraud unit so that any attempt to move funds would be traceable and stoppable. When I put it down on paper, it felt less like fantasy and more like a method. There was a relief in the structure. Perhaps the relief was what sustained me through those nights when I could not sleep, when the house felt like a place of waiting. I had not yet canceled any tickets. I had not yet enacted the thing the title promises, but I had begun to gather the things that would make that kind of action possible without lawlessness. Documents, witnesses, bank flags, and a solicitor who understood the need for swift, lawful steps. The story was aligning itself into a plan, and the plan required patience, an unpopular commodity when betrayal has jolted your life. The next morning, as the fog lifted from the fields and the inn smelled of baking bread, I felt a small, steady heartbeat in my chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with becoming purposeful again. I was no longer just a woman by the road with a suitcase. I was, for now, someone making a list and checking it twice, someone who would not let the story of her life be rewritten by those who thought they had the right to do so. The air tasted like copper and resolve. There were many more steps to take. There were explanations to be written for Dr. Murray, copies to be sent to James, and time for the bank's compliance team to do their work. There were also conversations I would have to have that would hurt and perhaps never heal. But for the first time since I had been left on that lane, I did not feel entirely adrift. And somewhere in the planning of it all was a hard, quiet possibility. If executed properly, if the banks and the solicitors and the investigators did their part, any attempt by Jessica and Brian to access stolen funds or to make their plans work could be interrupted.
There are ways that financial institutions can identify linked accounts, and when there is an active fraud investigation, banks can freeze funds and flag associated services. Airlines and travel services, when they are notified of linked suspicious activity, sometimes place holds on reservations connected to identified accounts. I did not know then whether those outcomes would happen. I only knew how to gather the proof that might produce them. That was as far as I could go with certainty. I had assembled the beginning of a record, and I had started the formal legal process that would, in time, open the possibility that the forces of bureaucracy could be used to prevent further harm. I had not yet deployed any action that would cancel any tickets myself. What I had done in those weeks of photographing and filing and making phone calls was assemble a legal and evidential framework that would allow other people, professionals with badges and authority, to intervene on my behalf. I am not the sort of person who makes a law out of a grudge. I make a case, and then I let the case do the work. Dr. Murray returned with a small satchel of tools in a steadier pace. She handled the portrait like someone greeting an old friend. "Margaret," she said, after an hour of looking and testing and some brittle little sounds as she turned pages of my grandmother's letters, "these items are properly documented and, more importantly, consistently linked. That crest appears in the estate records, and that stitch pattern on the lace is distinctive to a workshop we can trace to 1890s Yorkshire. Taken together, this is not a handful of family keepsakes. This is a coherent archive." She wrote a short, careful report that used the language of museums and courts both. Provenance established to the extent reasonably possible. Chain of custody traceable through Duncan's ledgers and your grandmother's annotations. Recommendation that certain items be conserved before sale. The report was dry, but in it was the kind of authority that makes a piece of paper behave like a tool. James, the solicitor, used that tool. He drafted letters to the bank that were precise in a way I had learned to love. Dates, document numbers, scanned images of labels, sworn statements from Duncan, the warehouse inventory, and Dr. Murray's assessment. He asked the bank to treat the documents as evidence in a dispute and to hold any transfers that appeared to originate from accounts linked by recipient or IP address to the transactions already flagged. He asked them to involve the financial crimes team. He also wrote to a local policing unit that handles fraud. The word investigation arrived like a slow animal that took time to sit down in the corner of the room and look at you. We did not stage a trap. We asked for scrutiny. The difference, Basil would have told you if he were here, is the difference between sharpening a knife and learning to sew. One can be used for harm. The other is craft.
We wanted the bank and the police to watch. We gave them the ledger of evidence and said, in effect, if anything moves, please tell us. Meanwhile, Moira and I kept working. We formed a small, honest partnership, MacLeod and Caldwell Antiquities, a name that felt both ridiculous and right. We put it together with a written memorandum, percentages, responsibilities, where funds would be held pending sale. We split things in a way that made sense. I had the family connection and the provenance. Moira had hospitality, local knowledge, and a storeroom that became our cataloging room. Duncan signed as witness. We opened a business account for small, legitimate expenses, bubble wrap, conservator fees, and we kept every receipt. Then came the work that, oddly, felt like the most ordinary and the most redemptive thing, cataloging. We photographed, measured, described, and for each item wrote where it had been and what evidence we had. It was like writing little lives for objects. The portrait got a careful cleaning. The silver was desilvered and polished by a conservator Dr. Murray recommended. The lace was stabilized and boxed. Each small action made the past less fragile and gave the present a way to hold on. There was an auction house in the city that did responsibly vetted sales. We contacted them with a conservative estimate. We'll take them, the auctioneer said, if the paper trail is firm. He asked for provenance materials, conservator notes, and a modest reserve price that would cover fees and leave a margin for the partnership. The hammer, when it came, felt like acknowledgement rather than triumph. On the day of the first sale, Moira and I went to the auction house and sat in the second row. The room was warm with people and the smell of good paper. The portrait went under the hammer for a sum that made my hands shake when I realized the number on the sheet. It was not obscene, and it was not small. It was enough to make the upcoming conservator bills and solicitor invoices less frightening. When the gavel came down, I felt a lightness like a breath exhaled after holding it for too long. We had turned evidence into recovery without drama, just papers signed, processes observed. Those sales mattered far beyond the money. They were, in a way, a public ledger that contradicted the private narrative that had been forming in that house where I had been the guest. They said, quietly but loudly, that items with labels stitched in my grandmother's hand had been authenticated and given value by experts who were not family. They gave weight to the documents we had already put in James's folder. Jessica watched the sales with an expression I could not read. She could, when she chose, appear proud as a mother. She could also appear restless, like someone who had been watching a clock waiting for a more convenient hour to move. On the phone, she sent messages that were at best curious. You always had good taste, and at worst manipulative. We could do more if we worked together properly. I read them the way one reads weather, information, not instruction. Then came the day they left. Not the first time on the lane, but a leaving that would be the origin of the title in a literal sense. Jessica and Brian had booked return tickets, ostensibly to go back to their life across the ocean after a week. They told me they needed to return early for work. The children were entrusted to a neighbor for the morning. My grandchildren's faces a brief ache. I had had dinner with them the night before. Brian hugged me in a way that felt slippery with calculation. He had always been good at gestures that signal normalcy. The investigators, the bank's fraud unit, and a detective from the financial crimes office had been in touch with James. They were cautious and methodical. We want to see what moves, the detective had told me. If we can catch an attempt to move funds or to use forged documents again, it's stronger for prosecution. That statement was not a promise. It was a strategy. What we agreed upon, in council with the bank and the detective, was a monitored transfer plan. The investigators would be ready to watch if an unauthorized access to accounts occurred. James and I prepared some accounts, a structure designed not to bait people into crime, but to let the investigators observe any attempt to exploit the access we had shown existed. The accounts were not filled with actual large sums. They were carefully controlled. The police would intervene if anything irregular began to move. That morning, when Jessica and Brian told me they were leaving early, their return flights were already booked. They had arranged them using a card that, as it turned out, the bank had linked to suspicious activity in their earlier transfers. The detective advised James, and James advised me, that if the bank flagged the accounts as connected to fraudulent transfers, the bank could coordinate with service providers to suspend or cancel linked bookings. It is a process. It has forms and emails and chain of custody for data. It is not a revenge plot. It is a legal and administrative response to evidence of fraud. They kissed the children, loaded suitcases into a car, and told me they'd be back soon. They drove away with the taillights shrinking in the same mist that had once left me standing under a sky that promised and then broke. I watched them go with a strange steadiness. I had done all I could to set the conditions for a lawful interruption of their plan if they attempted to take what had been documented as family heirlooms or to access funds that the investigators had been alerted to. Late that afternoon, when the detective called, his voice was clinical, but there was a small note of human satisfaction. There was an attempt to initiate transfers, he said.
From accounts and IP addresses we've been watching, we immediately issued holds and contacted the receiving institutions. We also notified services that were connected to the payment methods, including the carrier used for their flights. Because the transfers are now under formal investigation, and because the cards used to book the return travel are being disputed, the airline has suspended the reservations pending verification. I remember the way the floor felt under my feet when he said suspended. It was a legal word, and it felt like the law had reached out and put a hand on what had been moving. The airline did not tell us their reasons in detail for privacy and security, but when a booking is tied to a card under an active dispute or an account connected to an identified fraud event, many service providers will place a hold or cancel the reservation. It's not a perfect system, and it can be frustrating for genuine customers, but in our case, it meant the exact practical thing the title promised. Later, when Jessica called from a number that seemed rehearsed with civility, she said, "There must be some mistake with the cards. The booking wouldn't be affected because we pay for it." Her voice had the pale calm of someone trying to make the world behave as she had planned. "Perhaps," I said, "but there's an investigation. The bank told us they're on it." Her silence at the other end, long enough to be a small animal, told me that some part of their machinations had encountered a seam. Brian's messages became brisk and, for the first time, anxious. They called the airline and were told their return bookings had been suspended pending verification of payment sources. They were not allowed to check in. They could, the airline said, present documentation to resolve it, but as the bank had informed them, this was now a matter under review. It is a strange thing to see your life rewritten by paperwork and phone calls, but that is precisely what had happened. In a legal and administrative choreography we had not created, as Margaret trying to outwit her daughter, but as a plaintiff gathering evidence and professionals doing their work, their ability to leave was compromised. Flights do not depart when payments are disputed, and when accounts linked to fraud are flagged by financial institutions. The airline's policies exist in part to minimize liability. In our case, they had the side effect of canceling the very travel plans that had been arranged by people whose actions were under scrutiny. When Jessica and Brian realized they could not leave on their booked flights, their tone changed. Suddenly there was urgency. Suddenly there were offers. "Can't we talk? We can sort this here," Jessica wrote, a stream of messages shrinking the distance in language but not in consequence. I did not feel triumphant. I felt as if something heavy and rotten had been finally pried open. I also felt resolute.
There is a difference between victory and proper process. We had pursued process. The process had done its quiet, unglamorous work. They tried other routes. Alternative bookings, phone calls, frantic messages to friends. When the summer fog lifts, people talk. Someone mentioned a possible case of redirected packages and the neighbor's witness statements. Someone else noticed the crates moved in the dark. All of it became part of the record. The investigators followed it. The bank's compliance team continued to work methodically, and every time a suspicious movement occurred, they executed a hold. There was a painful confrontation a few days later, when Jessica knocked on the inn door like a woman trying to reclaim an entry she'd always assumed open. She came with the children, as if a maternal halo could shield what had been done. "We just want you back at home," she said, when I opened the door. Her voice trembled at the edges, in a way that could have been emotion or performance. Brian stayed in the background, his face a map of inconvenience and calculation. He looked tired, which was a strange form of fatigue for someone who had planned such precise things. I listened as children ran in circles between the tables. They wanted biscuits, they wanted stories, they wanted me. They were not party to all of the grown-up shadows. They could be loving and uncomplicated. I would not punish them for their parents' choices.
Jessica quick-stepped into an apology, then tried to convert it into a negotiation. "We can work this out," she said. "You can let us manage the estate, and we'll make sure you are comfortable." "No," I said. The word was a small, sharp thing. "You can cooperate with the investigation. You can return anything that belongs to the estate, but I will not sign anything that subordinates my rights to your convenience." Her face moved through surprise to something like anger. "You're being dramatic," she said. "We could just—" "This is not about drama," I interrupted. "This is about documents and law. I have given everything necessary to James and to the bank. If you have nothing to hide, it will be clearer for everyone that you acted in good faith." She left that evening with the children, but there was no softness in the farewell. Brian was taut with plans abandoned. They tried to rebook flights through other carriers, used different cards, and made new arrangements. But each time the investigators and the banks were watching the movements that had been signaled. Whenever an account connected to them tried to move money or to validate payments on the disputed transfers, holds were placed. Some bookings were canceled automatically by the systems when payments were reversed or disputed. We did not dance in triumph. We carried on with the business. The second auction produced another modest success. We invested conservatively in advertising, reached out to a secondary market dealer, and slowly built a modest but genuine client base.
People began to come to the inn to see the objects. Some wanted to buy single pieces, others asked about consulting. It was, in its small way, a reclamation of value. Eventually, a quiet thing happened that felt like a conclusion without celebration. The bank notified James that certain transfers had been reversed and that the receiving accounts were being monitored by law enforcement. I was told, carefully, by the detective, that their case would proceed on the basis of evidence collected so far. He did not and would not promise outcomes. The law is not a fairy tale. It is a slow, stubborn beast that sometimes reaches justice and sometimes does not. But the important part was that their access had been halted, and the practical effect included the cancellation or suspension of travel reservations that were linked to the disputed payments or cards. I want to be absolutely clear about this. I did not, on my own, pluck their tickets from the sky. What happened was institutional. I gathered evidence and presented it. Experts authenticated, solicitors filed, banks placed holds, and law enforcement advised service providers. In the end, administrative and legal mechanisms, not a quiet revenge, were the reason Jessica and Brian's ability to travel as they had planned was interrupted. It was, in every step, a byproduct of asking the proper authorities to look when I had proof in my hands. What followed was the hard, less dramatic work of setting boundaries. I refused to be coerced into private settlements. I refused to allow the children to be used as emotional leverage. I allowed them visitation in carefully arranged witness settings, always with transparency and never in isolation. I restricted access to accounts, changed passwords, and followed James' advice about changing powers of attorney language and checking documents. The solicitor helped me rewrite how my affairs were handled, ensuring that nothing could be signed in my name without a clear, verified process. There were still things that hurt. There were the small betrayals that cannot be counted as money, the loss of trust, the recognition that people you love are fallible in ways that scar. There were nights when I imagined conversations that would never be had, apologies that would have meant something, and reconciliations that would not hinge on legal advantage. But those imaginations are in the end fantasies. Real life demands real steps. In the months after the auctions and the investigations, Malaud and Caldwell Antiquities became, at its own modest pace, a proper business. We had a small showroom, amber light, close-up labels that told the stories of objects, and a website that Dr. Murray had helped with interviews for. We held small talks about provenance and the ethics of collecting. People came from nearby towns. Some of them were collectors, others simply curious. We donated a small portion of proceeds to a local historical society and to an elder support charity, something that felt right after the ways my own age had made me vulnerable. I was invited to speak at a small conference about provenance and stewardship. Standing at a podium in a room lit with 2 bright lamps, I told the audience, plainly, about the difference between stewardship and seizure, between family warmth and transactional calculation. I did not recount the most private embers of pain. There is dignity in discretion. But I spoke about the importance of documentation, of formal wills, and of the practical ways older people can protect their assets within the law. The applause that followed was not for revenge. It was for a life rearranged and still moving forward. As for Jessica and Brian, the relationship did not heal into what it had been. There were attempts, some clumsy, some sincere, to find a foothold, but I had changed the shape of my life in ways that no longer allowed for the old compromises.
I established boundaries that were both practical and moral, monitored communication, legal oversight of any financial interplay, and a firm refusal to allow my agency to be brokered away by familial pressure. The grandchildren remained part of my life in selective, observed visits. I could love them without surrendering myself. If there is one thing that sustained me through those months, it was the slow reconstruction of my sense of self. The work reclaimed a part of me that had been boxed away when caregiving and family expectations had become the mainstay. I found again the pleasure of analyzing a frame corner, of reading a ledger entry with a smile, of explaining to someone why a stitch pattern matters. The business was modest, but it was mine. It was built in sunlight and with receipts and with hands that knew how to measure threads. And the phrase, the one the title leans on, became for a time a literal reality framed by law and process. Their return flights were canceled, in part because the payments used were connected to accounts under formal dispute, and because the institutions involved acted within their risk management frameworks in response to an investigation. I did not and would not claim a cinematic heroism in that. I claim instead a procedural, meticulous persistence, a woman who gathered documents, who found allies, and who let formal systems do the enforcing. In the end, there was an unexpected quietness. The scandal faded not because I forgave everything, but because I refused to let the story continue in their terms. I had regained enough of my material life to feel steady. People recognized our little shop in articles about responsible provenance. I was called once to give testimony, to an internal bank inquiry, later to an investigator, and I did so with a calm that surprised me. Month by month, the life I had built with Moira grew steadier.
We traveled to conferences together, sat across tables with dealers who respected provenance, and laughed over cups of tea in the evenings about small things. The inn where I had first slept became less a refuge and more a partner in a shared life. We signed contracts, we paid taxes, we learned to write invoices and to smile at clients who mistook us for something other than determined professionals. People will ask you sometimes what the cost was. There is no easy arithmetic for the quiet toll of betrayal, but I can tell you the gains: regained agency, a business that stands on honesty, and the knowledge that I had the right to defend what was mine without becoming unjust. The law and the institutions I called on were imperfect and slow, that is true, but when combined with evidence, they were powerful enough to interrupt plans that have been designed to take what was not meant to be taken. If you are listening and you have felt the sharpness of trust broken, I will tell you plainly: document what you can, ask for help, and let the right authorities do their work. You do not have to be a museum professional to protect yourself, but if you have skills, they can become tools to steady you. And if you are older and worried, start small: copies of documents, a solicitor recommendation, a trusted friend who knows how to keep a record. The rest is method. I did not end by making my daughter vanish from my life in a single gesture. Families are not erased by litigations or freezes. But I did end by asserting a boundary so firm that their return, in any form that would harm me, was made impossible. In practical terms, that meant legal steps. In emotional terms, that meant a refusal to be manipulated by the language of love used as a cloak for taking. In both registers, it meant survival, and ultimately, a steady work of rebuilding. On a late autumn afternoon, Moira and I locked the showroom after a small but satisfying sale. The light through the front window was the color of old paper. We closed the door. The bell chimed, and I felt an ordinary kind of gratitude, the kind that comes from doing things right, even when right is slow. I walked home through the lane not as an abandoned woman, but as a woman with a ledger, a partner, and a life she had chosen again. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever been left in a place you didn't expect, emotionally or geographically, please share your own experience in the comments. There is power in testimony and in community. And if you want to hear more stories about people who found a way forward after being underestimated, subscribe and let's keep telling them. Thank you for listening.